A man shoved a 73-year-old woman out of her chair at a harbour-side diner in Pelican Cove, Nova Scotia. He didn't shove her by accident. He did it slowly, deliberately, with one thick hand on her shoulder, pressing down until she lost her balance and slid onto the cold tile floor. The room went quiet. 30 people watched. Not one of them moved. He laughed. He thought he was untouchable. He had been untouchable in this town for 11 years. He owned the mayor's re-election fund, the sheriff's pension top-up, and the permits for every new build on the eastern waterfront. He thought he owned the silence in that room, too. He didn't know her son was a Navy SEAL. He didn't know that her son had just parked his truck 2 blocks away, that he was walking toward the diner at that exact moment, his German shepherd moving at his left heel, quiet and precise as a shadow on snow. He didn't know that the last 11 years had not been kind to men who underestimated what walked in when that door opened. He was about to find out. The morning had started the way most mornings in Pelican Cove started in late September. Cold, salt air off the Atlantic, the cry of herring gulls over the wharf, and the smell of diesel from the fishing boats already out before dawn. The town sat on the eastern tip of Nova Scotia, the kind of place that appeared on postcards but rarely on maps. 3,000 people, one main street, a harbor full of lobster traps and old money, and new developers who had discovered in the last decade that authenticity could be packaged and sold at a significant markup. Rosalind Vance was 73 years old. She had white hair cut short, reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her forehead even when she wasn't reading, and the kind of posture that came from decades of not letting the world press her down. She had lived in Pelican Cove for 41 years. She had taught elementary school for 32 of them. She knew the names of most of the children who had grown up in this town, and many of their children now too. Her husband Gerald had died 4 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the way he would have wanted. Her son Camden had bought her a small cedar-sided house on Kittiwake Lane the year after that, close enough to the water that she could hear the waves from her bedroom window, far enough from the tourist shops that she could still think. He came home when he could, which was not often. His work made that difficult. Rosalind didn't complain. She knew what his work was. She knew what it cost him and what it cost her, and she had made her peace with the arithmetic of it a long time ago. She walked into the Anchor and Bell Diner at 9:20 on a Tuesday, the same way she had walked in every Tuesday for 6 years. Tara, the young woman who worked the morning shift, saw her come through the door and already had the coffee poured, before Rosalind had settled into her usual booth by the window. The booth faced the harbor. The water was iron gray and cold-looking. A container ship sat anchored out beyond the breakwater. Rosalind thought it looked like a good morning to read and be left alone. She was wrong about that. The man who walked in 20 minutes later was named Brogan Holt. He was 56 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had since gone to fat and grievance. He wore a Carhartt jacket over a pressed shirt, which was a kind of uniform in this part of the world. Working man's clothes worn by a man who hadn't done actual work in a decade. He had built Holt Coastal Developments into the dominant construction and land acquisition firm on the eastern shore. Not through quality work, but through an instinct for leverage. He knew who needed permits. He knew who owed money. He knew which marriages were fragile and which reputations could not afford a rumor. He had 3 men with him. They sat at the counter. He sat wherever he wanted. He wanted the booth next to Rosalind's. He didn't need it. The diner had 8 other empty booths. He chose that one the way a cat chooses a spot on a warm chair, not out of need, but to establish a fact. Tara watched him come in, and her expression didn't change. She had learned not to let it change around Brogan Holt. She moved behind the counter and poured 4 coffees without being asked. She did not look at Rosalind. She knew what was coming, and she felt helpless about it, and she hated that feeling with a quiet ferocity she had carried for 2 years. Brogan sat down. He did not open a menu. He looked sideways at Rosalind for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has already decided belongs to him. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he said. He said it pleasantly. Rosalind looked up from her book. "Good morning," she said, and looked back down. "Still holding out on the Kittiwake property," he said. It was not a question. "I'm reading," she said. He shifted in his seat, turning toward her more fully. His voice stayed pleasant. That was the worst part of it, Tara would later say. He stayed pleasant right up until he didn't. "You know what that lot is worth right now? You know what I'm offering? I had a conversation with Marguerite Walsh. She sold her place on Fisher's Point last spring, bought a condo in Halifax, doesn't have to worry about a thing. Her kids are set." He paused. "Your son's never here. You're rattling around in that house alone. It doesn't make sense." "My son bought that house for me," Rosalind said. She did not look up. "It's not for sale." "Your son," Brogan said, and there was something in his voice now, a small, ugly shift, "is a ghost. He drops money on a property in a town he never visits, and leaves his mother here to cause problems for people who actually live and work in this community." Rosalind set her book down. She looked at him. Her expression was the one she had used for 32 years on children who had done something they knew was wrong and were hoping she hadn't noticed. "I suggest," she said quietly, "that you enjoy your coffee." Something moved across Brogan's face. The pleasantness went out of it like a lamp being switched off. He stood up. He was a large man. Standing, he filled the narrow space between the booths. The three men at the counter turned on their stools to watch. The other people in the diner, a right-eyed couple near the door, two young mothers with strollers, a man in his 40s with a laptop. All of them went still. They knew what Brogan Holt looked like when the pleasant version of him ran out. "You think you can just sit there and smile at me," he said, and his voice was low now. Not angry loud, but angry cold, which was worse. "You think because your son sends money from wherever he is, playing soldier, that you can park yourself in this town and spit in the face of everything we're trying to build here." "I am not spitting in anyone's face," Rosalind said. "I am having breakfast." He reached across and swept her coffee cup off the table. It shattered on the floor. Coffee spread in a dark stain across the tile. Tara, behind the counter, flinched. Her hand found her phone. Rosalind stood up. She was not a tall woman. She stood anyway. "You need to leave," she said. Brogan stepped forward, one hard shove of his palm against her shoulder. She had been half standing, and the angle was wrong, and she went down. She didn't fall violently. It wasn't dramatic, the way it sometimes is in films. She simply lost her footing and sat down hard on the cold tile floor, her book skidding away under the next table, her glasses sliding off her face. The room was absolutely silent. Tara's phone was already recording. Her hands were shaking. She kept them steady by pressing her elbows against the counter. Brogan looked down at Rosalind. He said something low that the recording would later not quite pick up. Then he turned back toward his booth, adjusting his jacket, as if nothing of particular importance had occurred. That was when the bell above the door rang. Camden Vance was 38 years old. He stood 6'1" and weighed 190, none of it soft. He wore dark cargo pants, a gray thermal, and a quilted vest. His hair was short on the sides and slightly longer on top, and it needed a cut. He had been in Pelican Cove for 36 hours, the first leave he had taken in 14 months. He had come home to see his mother and to sleep in a real bed and to walk along the water with Kodiak. Kodiak was the dog at his left heel, 92 pounds of black and tan German Shepherd, chest broad as a wine barrel, ears up and tracking. He moved the way. Camden moved, quietly, economically, always reading the room. Camden stepped through the door. His eyes went to his mother on the floor. They went to the shattered coffee cup. They went to Brogan Holt, standing 3 feet from Rosalind with his back half turned, looking satisfied with himself. Camden took all of this in roughly 1 second. He said one word, very quietly, to Kodiak, "Watch." Kodiak didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He moved forward on silent paws, and placed himself between Rosalind and Brogan with the smooth, unhurried precision of a machine that had been built for exactly this purpose. He went into a crouch. The sound that came from his chest was not a bark. It was something older and more serious. His eyes did not move from Brogan. Brogan turned around. He took one look at the dog and stepped back, one involuntary step. His face went the color of old concrete. Camden was already moving past him. He knelt beside his mother. His voice, when he spoke to her, was completely different from every other sound he had made since walking through the door. "Mum." His hand on her shoulder, gentle. "You okay?" "I'm fine." She reached up and held his wrist for a moment. "I'm completely fine, Camden." He helped her to her feet. He checked her over without making it obvious he was checking. Hands, arms, the way she was standing, her breathing. She was shaken. She was not hurt. He picked her glasses up from the floor and gave them to her. Then he turned to look at Brogan Holt. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked. Brogan had recovered some of his composure. He was a man who had spent 20 years making other people small, and the habit was hard to break even when something in front of you was advising strongly against it. "Listen, pal," he started. "You put your hands on her," Camden said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same flat tone he might use to read coordinates off a map. There was a misunderstanding. There wasn't. From a booth at the far end of the diner, a man in his 60s shifted in his seat. He wore a checked shirt and a deputy's badge. His name was Hugh, and he had been eating a ham sandwich for the past 20 minutes and watching the whole thing unfold with the particular kind of stillness that meant he was calculating how much trouble any action on his part might cause. He owed Brogan Holt 3 favors. That was a fact. He now pushed himself out of his booth, hitching his belt, and walked toward the center of the room. "All right," Hugh said, spreading his hands. "Let's all just take a breath here. Brogan, why don't you?" "I want a formal report filed," Camden said. He didn't look at Hugh when he said it. He was still looking at Brogan. "My mother was physically assaulted. There are witnesses. The waitress appears to have a recording." He glanced at Tara. She nodded, once, almost imperceptibly. "I want a report filed tonight, and I want to see the file number." Hugh's jaw tightened. "Son, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a local matter and we handle things locally." Camden looked at him for the first time. Just looked. Hugh stopped talking. "My name is Camden Vance. My mother's name is Rosalind." She was sitting in this diner at 9:20 in the morning, and a man shoved her to the floor. He paused. "If a report is not filed by end of business today, I'm going to make some phone calls, and the people I call are not local." He put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Come on, Mum. Let's get you home." He guided her toward the door. As they passed the counter, he caught Tara's eye and gave her a small, steady nod. She looked back at him, and her chin lifted fractionally. Outside, the September air was cold and sharp off the water. Camden settled Rosalind into the passenger seat of his truck, a black F-250, mud on the wheel wells from the logging road he'd taken to the lake 2 days ago. He checked her again. She waved him off with one hand, which meant she was all right, and also meant she wanted him to stop hovering, which he had always found difficult. He walked around to the driver's side. He pulled out his phone. Not his personal phone, a second one, matte black, no case, that he kept in the left inside pocket of his vest. He found a contact, hit call. It was answered in 2 rings. Vance. His voice had gone completely flat. "I'm in Pelican Cove, Nova Scotia. I need to flag a situation. Local deputy appears compromised. There's a civilian, Brogan Holt, Holt Coastal Developments, who physically assaulted a military dependent this morning. The incident is on video. I believe the assault is connected to a systematic land acquisition scheme targeting waterfront property owners." He listened. "I have reason to think it goes higher than Holt. I need someone to start pulling the thread on Holt Coastal. Corporate structure, municipal contracts, political contributions. Quietly." He listened again. "Understood. I'll forward the civilian recording when I'm at a secure location." He ended the call. Rosalind looked at him. She had heard the whole thing. "You knew about the land scheme before this morning," she said. It was not a question either. She had always been able to do that. Take the shape of a silence and know what was inside it. "I had some idea," Camden said. She looked at him steadily. "How much of an idea?" "I've been home 36 hours, Mum. I ran some searches last night. Property records are public." He started the truck. "The pattern's not subtle. 14 properties on the eastern waterfront sold to Holt subsidiaries in the past 3 years. All of them after the owners had some kind of trouble. Bylaw violations, permit delays, noise complaints from neighbors who turned out not to exist." He pulled out onto the main road. Yours was the only holdout. She was quiet for a moment. "Gerald would have called the newspaper," she said. Camden glanced at her. "I know. He always thought the newspaper could fix things." "It can," Camden said. "Just not always fast enough." Across town, in the second floor of the Pelican Cove Municipal Building, Alderman Prescott Dahl was on his 3rd cup of coffee and his 4th antacid when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, Brogan. He felt the antacid dissolve uselessly against the acid tide in his stomach. "Tell me you saw the video," Brogan said without preamble. "What video?" "The waitress posted it. 40,000 views. It's on 3 different Facebook groups. Someone's tagged the provincial media page." Prescott stood up from his chair and walked to his window. The harbor was gray and cold below him. He had been alderman for 9 years. He had a daughter at Dalhousie. He had a mortgage on a waterfront property of his own. The deal Brogan had given him, 6 years ago, when the numbers otherwise didn't work. He had told himself at the time that it was just sensible financial planning. "I'll call Hugh," he said. Hugh already made a mess of it. "There's a man, her son, he's ex-military. He's claiming the deputy is compromised. He's talking about federal contacts. He's bluffing." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "You don't know that." Prescott pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'll handle it, Brogan. You said that about the Walsh property, and we nearly had a provincial investigation." "I handled it. Handle this faster," Brogan said, and hung up. Prescott sat back down at his desk. He pulled up the video on his laptop. He watched Rosalind Vance hit the floor. He watched the aftermath, the dog appearing in the frame, that still and terrible stillness. He watched the man who came through the door, the way he moved through the scene, unhurried and completely certain. He felt, with a cold clarity that cut through the antacid and the coffee and the 9 years of rationalization, that he was looking at a problem he did not know how to solve. Across the harbor, in a clean white house at the end of Driftwood Road, Brogan Holt's wife sat at her kitchen table with her own laptop and watched the same video. Her name was Cecily. She was 51 years old, slim, with gray coming in at her temples that she had stopped coloring 6 months ago. She had a degree in environmental law from Dahl. She had stopped practicing when she married Brogan. 22 years. She watched Rosalind Vance fall to the floor. She watched the room do nothing. She had told herself, for a long time, that the things Brogan did were not truly her business, that she didn't know enough to judge, that every business had compromises. She had stopped saying those things to herself about a year ago, when she had found the folder on his study desktop. Misfiled, not hidden, he had never been careful, because he had never needed to be, containing the emails with Prescott Dahl. The emails detailed, in Brogan's blunt and unsentimental prose, exactly how each of the 14 waterfront properties had been acquired, what pressures had been applied, what had been threatened and to whom. She had not done anything with that knowledge. She had closed the folder and gone back to her book, and told herself she would decide what to do later. Later had arrived. She opened a new email. She addressed it to an investigative journalist at the Halifax Chronicle she had met once, 5 years ago. At a fundraiser, she had kept the woman's card in the inside pocket of her address book. Her hands were steady. She began to type. The next morning, Camden sat at the kitchen table in his mother's house on Kittiwake Lane. his encrypted laptop open, Kodiak asleep under the table with his head on Camden's left foot. Rosalind was in the next room. He could hear the sound of the kettle. His contact had called at 6 a.m. with the first layer of what they'd found. Holt Coastal Developments was a shell, atop a shell, atop a shell. The money at the core of it did not come from construction or from land development. It came from two numbered companies registered in Ontario with directors whose names were fictional. Those companies had received, over 4 years, 17 transfers from a holding entity in the Cayman Islands called Seabird Capital Group. Seabird had one publicly listed director, Prescott Dahl. Camden had sat with that for a moment. Then he had kept reading. The 14 waterfront properties, purchased by Holt's subsidiaries, had all received new development permits within 30 days of acquisition. The permits had all been signed by the same zoning officer. The zoning officer's brother-in-law owned 3% of one of the numbered companies. It was not subtle. It had never needed to be subtle, because no one had ever looked. Camden closed the laptop when he heard his mother come into the kitchen. She set a cup of tea in front of him and sat down across the table. Kodiak's tail thumped twice against the floor without him waking up. "You've been up all night," she said. "Some of it you're on leave." "I know." She looked at him for a moment. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "I want to know what it is. I'm not a bystander in my own situation." He looked back at her. He thought about arguing. He thought better of it. He turned the laptop around and let her read. She read quietly. Her expression didn't change much. He watched her read the section about Prescott Dahl. Her chin went up slightly, the way it did when she was angry and choosing not to show it. "His daughter was in my grade 4 class," she said. "I know. She was a lovely child. Drew horses on everything." She pushed the laptop back across the table. "What happens now?" "Now," Camden said, "we wait for some people to arrive." They arrived the next morning. 2 unmarked sedans. 4 people, 2 RCMP officers from the Commercial Crimes Section in Halifax, 1 investigator from the Provincial Attorney General's office, and a woman named Superintendent Barker from the Federal Integrated Market Enforcement Team, who had driven from Moncton and looked like she had been waiting for someone to hand her exactly this file. Camden walked them through what he had. He walked them through Tara's video, the property records, the corporate structure, the financial transfers, and the emails his contact had managed to surface. Superintendent Barker listened with her arms crossed, and her eyes moving constantly between Camden and the documents. She asked 3 questions, each of them precise. Camden gave 3 precise answers. At the end of it, she said, "How did you put this together in 48 hours?" "I had help," Camden said, "and the structure wasn't designed to survive scrutiny. It was designed to avoid it." She nodded slowly. "We'll take it from here." She paused. "Your mother is all right. She's fine, good." Barker looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was not quite approving and not quite something else. "You should take the rest of your leave, Commander Vance." The arrests came on the 4th day after that. Brogan Holt was taken from his office at Holt Coastal, mid-morning, by 2 RCMP officers. He walked out in handcuffs past his assistant and his project manager and the site foreman who had been waiting for a meeting. He did not say anything. The pleasant version of him and the unpleasant version of him had both run out. Prescott Dahl was arrested at the municipal building. He had apparently been expecting it since the morning. His assistant said later that he had arrived at 8, sat at his desk, and not made a single phone call. Hugh, the deputy, was charged separately with obstruction and misconduct. He sat in the back of the cruiser and stared at the floor. The zoning officer resigned before the charges were filed, and then was charged anyway. Cecily Holt's email to the Halifax Chronicle had arrived 2 days before the arrests. The journalist had cross-referenced it with a tip she had received from a different source, confirmed 3 key facts, and published on the morning of day 3. By the time the RCMP moved, the story had been picked up by CBC and the Globe and Mail and was trending in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick. The story included one photograph. It was a still from Tara's video. Rosalind on the floor, Brogan's back to the camera, and just visible through the glass door of the diner, blurred but unmistakable. A tall figure, and, at his heel, the unmistakable silhouette of a German shepherd. The town meeting happened on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks later. The community hall was full. People stood along the back wall. A man named Victor, the newly appointed interim administrator from the province, ran it efficiently and without drama. About halfway through, the door at the back opened and Brogan Holt walked in. The room went quiet in a different way than the diner had gone quiet. Not out of fear. Out of something else. Something harder to name. He looked smaller than he had. Not physically smaller. Just diminished, the way people become diminished when the thing they relied on to make them large has been taken away. He walked to the microphone at the front of the room. He didn't look at Victor. He looked at Rosalind Vance, who was sitting in the third row. "I've been advised not to make any statements," he said. "I'm making one anyway." He stopped. "What I did in that diner, there's no version of it that was acceptable. There's no version of it that was business, or frustration, or a bad morning. I put my hands on an elderly woman because I thought I was beyond consequences. I was wrong about that." He stopped again. His hands on the podium were not steady. "I know that an apology is not restitution. I know what restitution has to look like. My lawyers are working with the AG's office on the properties, on returning what was taken, or making the families whole where returning it isn't possible. That's not enough, either. But it's what I can do, and I'm going to do it." He looked at Rosalind one more time. She held his gaze. Her expression gave him nothing easy and nothing hard. It simply held him to account. Then he walked back to the door and out of the room. The hall was quiet for a moment. Then, a woman in her 60s named Harriet, who had sold her property on the point 3 years ago and moved to Truro, stood up. She didn't say anything. She just stood. Then a man named Douglas, who had nothing to do with any of this. He was a retired fisherman who had come to the meeting because he was curious, stood up too. Then one by one, others rose. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was something more provisional and more important. The acknowledgement that the town was still here, and that it could, if it chose to, become something worth staying in. At the back of the room, Camden leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. Kodiak sat at his heel, watching the room with calm, unblinking attention. The dog had become, over the past 3 weeks, a familiar sight in Pelican Cove. Children approached him carefully, the way children approach things they are not sure of, and he accepted their attention with dignified patience. He had been photographed more times than Camden could count. There were 2 different drawings of him in the window of the bakery on Main Street. He was, Camden had heard someone say, the town dog now. Camden was not sure he deserved that kind of status, or that Kodiak would agree to the terms. But he let it go. After the meeting, they walked home along the waterfront. The night was cold and clear. The lights of the harbor reflected off still water. Rosalind walked beside him, with her hands in her coat pockets and her chin slightly up the way she always walked. "Will you stay a little longer?" she asked. "I have 8 more days," he said. That's a yes, Mum." She nodded. They walked a little further in silence. Kodiak moved ahead on the path, nose working, unhurried. "You know what Gerald would have said," Rosalind said. "What?" She smiled slightly. "He would have said it's good to have someone looking out for the neighborhood." Camden looked out at the water. The container ship was gone from the anchorage. The harbor was quiet. He wasn't wrong, he said. There are towns like Pelican Cove all along the eastern coast of this country. Places that carry their history in the weathered wood of their wharves, in the names on their mailboxes, in the particular way the light falls off the water on a September morning. Places that seem small until you understand what it costs to keep them. The people who paid that cost, mostly, are not remarkable. They are retired schoolteachers with reading glasses pushed up on their foreheads. They are young women behind diner counters who press their elbows against the edge and hold their hands still. They are wives who find a folder left carelessly open and decide, after 22 years, that later has arrived. And sometimes they are a man and his dog stepping through a door at the right moment, arriving home.